February 21st, and we're going to be getting some presentations this morning and afternoon on fiscal year 26 budget requests. We're going to start with legal aid. So over to you if you could identify yourself for the record. Thanks for being here.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having us. I saw that you allotted an hour for us, and so I know that you really believe in our work and find it important. So I just want to say we're honored that you have us this morning. Yasmin Jidar, she, hers, Executive Director of Legal Aid. I'm here with a partner.
Sam Abel Palmer, Executive Director of Legal Services Vermont.
Thanks for being here.
So Vermont Legal Aid and Legal Services Vermont, we work hand in hand. I think the last time it was helpful to kind of give a little bit of a background. So Sam and I will just help refresh everyone's recollection on that. Vermont Legal Aid and Legal Services Vermont. Legal Services Vermont is kind of the hotline end that receives all the calls and has a pulse on the needs of the community just because of the magnitude of the call that come in. They retain some of these calls in the areas of law that they service, and then the other cases where we service, they send them over to us. The Vermont Legal Aid end is heavier on the litigation end and has the capacity to impact litigation. And Legal Services Vermont, talk a little about what they do.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, as I said, we do a lot of, because we're working on the helpline, a lot of what we do is short-term assistance, quick advice, something that we can do on a one-off phone call. We also do most of our direct service work in a couple of specific areas. We split the eviction work in the state with Vermont Legal Aid. So we're in 5 counties there in the remaining 9. About half and half on the population. And in those cases, you know, it's a mix of either full representation, helping people with pleadings, helping them just giving them some advice in the background when they're going into court on their own. We're also right now doing the primary work on consumers, so both bankruptcy and debt collection types of cases. And we work with private bar, especially to do volunteer work to pick up some of those, especially bankruptcy cases. We do run a broader volunteer lawyer program, so we bring in the private bar to help out, again, mostly on short-term assistance on cases. And then really just a range of other stuff. We have somebody who is kind of the point person for a lot of the providers for domestic violence. So people call the helpline if they're looking for assistance with domestic violence. And again, we do the primary screening and then send them many to legal aid and then to other partner agencies like the Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence and At Justice Will Travel, those other agencies. But we work in very close partnership with all of them.
And so whenever we make asks, a portion of the funding goes to cover some of the work that Legal Services Vermont does. But between both of our organizations, we serve low-income Vermonters in a variety of areas of law. Here are some of the areas of practice for Vermont Legal Aid. This is just a general overview of the areas where we serve clients. I did put a short summary for each of the projects that we do have, just so that you have some background information. So for instance, we have a consumer and homeowner rights project. They center their work around helping folks whose properties may be subject to foreclosure and or notice of sale because of unpaid taxes. They also help with estate planning. So for example, enhanced life estate deeds, where folks can kind of plan passing their estate to family members while still retaining tenancy and kind of avoiding the probate process, which can reduce pressure on the courts. And they're trying to do some consumer work, but because of limitations on funding, there's a capacity issue, but we're trying to at least do quick advice. So like I said in our last meeting, while we tend to be more on the litigation end, because of the volume of cases that we receive, a lot of our work has kind of become more quick advice as opposed to litigation. And so our services tend to be more limited. But I think it's the passion of our staff and wanting to do the work to maximize helping people that we're trying our best to stretch every single dollar. So I think Justice Carroll was here last time and she talked about a study that was conducted a couple of years ago where each dollar amounts to about $11 in terms of investment. For us, I feel like we're taking that $11 and trying to stretch it to 20 or more to still try to do the work. And our staff is really eager to help as many people as possible. I think the challenge, though, is that sometimes we have to say, sorry, but we're going to have to cut back this area of service. Sorry, we're going to have to cut back. And I actually just came from a meeting with our staff, having to talk about all of the funding issues, which we're going to get into, and the threats to federal funding and how that's going to impact us. And we're trying to do planning around that. But our projects are still working hard to serve Vermonters. We also have a disability law project where we help folks with issues linked to their disability, so abuse, neglect, exploitation. We help with benefits, discrimination, and we help with the representation piece. We also have our elder law project, which serves community members who are aged 60 and up. That project also deals with exploitation, neglect. They do some work doing appeals to ensure that Medicare pays for care. Yep, so the healthcare advocate, Mike was here earlier, but they tend to do their own legislative asks. But they help Vermonters figure out questions related to the healthcare system, understanding health insurance, which is relevant now, given the hardships around and or the increased cost of healthcare. We also have our housing discrimination law project, which we're probably going to talk about because this is the one that's most likely on the chopping block, given the recent layoffs of staff. In the past, we've had delays in terms of funding, and we've tried to figure out ways to close the gap, the funding gap. But given the layoffs, at minimum, we imagine that there's going to be significant delay, but anticipate that there's likely going to be termination of funding for housing discrimination law.
And you're talking layoffs at the federal level, right?
Yes. So our housing discrimination law project essentially deals with discrimination cases, whether it's race, gender, immigration status, disability. And so this is a very important area of work that we're really concerned about losing. We also have our Housing for Everyone law project, which we call HELP. We do outreach to all tenants who receive a notice for eviction, and we just try to ensure that they have access to legal services so that they have due process. But the issue with this particular project, and I talked a little bit about it the last time I was here, but that project is coming to an end. So the funding is scheduled to terminate in July of 25. And as you know, from the last session, we talked a lot about the spike in requests for assistance with eviction. The state of Vermont, as the rest of the country, has already been in a housing crisis. And poverty is also on the rise. And so between losing the housing discrimination law project, potentially losing the funding for eviction work, and also already the limited funding that's available even for homeowners, because Vermont is one of those states that has a high percentage of home ownership where folks can lose their homes to foreclosure or, let's say, failure to pay sometimes nominal amounts of tax, like $600, $2,000 for homes that are worth substantially more. I think is going to exacerbate the housing crisis and the poverty crisis in the state of Vermont. We also have the Vermont Long-Term Care Ombudsman Project. And so it protects the health, welfare, and rights of people who live in licensed long-term care facilities. And so I'm sure folks may be familiar with long-term care facilities, but we call it the VOP project. They help folks, for instance, who are in these facilities who may not be receiving proper care, like neglect, abuse. So you can imagine someone who might have not been changed for a while and or cared for properly or fed properly or had any form of agency within a long-term care facility, and it's more common than one would think. This project helps improve quality of life for those folks. I have the percentage here and I'll get to, but I think it was the last year that helped around, I think it was like 700 something folks, and at least 85% of those cases ended with favorable outcome for the people that they help. We also have our medical legal partnership, which is a partnership with UVM. So the cases that come through UVM where there are legal issues, we have a team that addresses those issues. It can range for anything from housing. Sometimes it can touch on immigration issues, custody, visitation, benefits. So it's a wide array of legal issues, but the referral has to come through the hospital. The Mental Health Law Project, appointed by the Superior Court, represents Vermonters in involuntary mental health treatment and/or medication cases in hospitals and in outpatient settings to ensure their rights and liberties are protected. And we represent folks in criminal cases where they've been determined incompetent to stand trial. Our MHLP project also, sorry, the pop-ups are throwing me off. Our MHLP project also represents the interests of folks with mental health problems who are subject to mental health statutes and regulations under consideration by the legislature, including the structure of involuntary mental health system. This is one of our projects that's actually are overburdened by work, and we're desperately seeking to help provide an attorney for that.
Can you go back to that one? So the mental health project is that in part because we specifically in legislation asked legal aid to represent these individuals.
Correct.
I mean, so we have actually created the obligation, and I mean, that should be connected to probably funding the obligation. So I want to make sure that that's connected when we're talking about whatever kind of ask.
I believe that is through the AHS.
It is.
It's through the AHS grant, yeah. So that's specifically with the kind of big, part of that big pile of, just general funding, but that's what funds the HLP.
Okay, and is that funding, is that goes through the Human Services Committee for that? Because I mean, where's the advocacy for that coming from in the building?
I think
For
actually,
healthcare.
well, I think it's a part of our state ask.
Yeah, I mean, it's the general ask, I think, yeah, I don't think it's not done separately. And it's administered through the Agency of Human Services,
Right.
but it comes out of the general.
Yeah, well, I think it should be part of this committee's budget memo, because this committee is where the requirement came through, in that bill, directing legal aid to provide the
And I'm
representation.
glad that you noticed that, because that is one of the issues when we have meetings, like we're mandated to do this work and we don't exactly have the capacity. And we've been trying to figure out internally how to provide support, but we're stretched so thin. We're literally trying to figure out where to move people. And we've had a hiring freeze for a while now, since the last time that I saw you, just because last year we believe that we were level funded. And as I said last year, like level funding is actually a loss to us because, there's an increase in cost to everything. And so this time around, obviously the challenges are increasing because costs continue to rise, but then there's also the threat of cuts to federal funding. And we imagine the threats to cuts for federal funding is likely going to impact the state and can ultimately impact the amount of money that the state is able to give us. And I have like numbers here and projections, and all of it is assuming just level funding, which we don't even know if the state is going to have capacity to accomplish that this year. But we're hoping to share as much information as possible so that the committee can understand the legal needs of Vermont legal aid. But we literally have someone in this project who has had a hard time even trying to schedule vacation. And we've tried to figure out giving her support staff, and it's just the volume of cases is so high. And
I just was looking at the numbers, it's just of those involuntary, the mental health cases, it's in the 15 to 1600 cases a year.
And as,
It's huge.
and as you can imagine, this line of work is not easy. I mean, in my prior place of employment, folks that are struggling with mental health issues, it's a huge emotional burden. But people take this on because they understand that folks need access to resources and representation. But to be short-staffed or to not have the requisite amount of staff to deal with the caseload, which is already heavy, is a challenge.
Is it your sense that you're short-staffed? Is the short staffing because of funding or hiring challenges or both?
I think it's more the funding, because we have a set amount of funding, like, I mean, I have the line items, I think mental health law project was around like 1.2 million last year, and we've tried to keep our staff consistent, trying to find it, because I have my staff.
Is it fair to say that seem to recall there are increased costs with cases like that as well? Like you might have to pay for, do you ever have to pay for like evaluations or?
I think that's covered within the funding that's provided.
Right, but I'm just saying like that, the funding isn't just to cover the attorneys who are working in this project, but everything that goes along with the cases, which might be more cost intensive than other types of cases. Is that?
I think it's because we have to hire,
Yeah, there are definitely some hired experts that come
Yeah,
along
yeah.
in a number of the cases. Not every case, but
Okay.
it does come up often.
and then if there's a conflict for some reason where we can't take on the case, since we're the only ones that are doing these cases, we have to hire outside counsel. It doesn't happen often also, but it is a part of, it can contribute to the cost. Our poverty law project, I mean, that's where we saw the most substantial, I think, decrease in staff. It used to be a really robust program with a number of attorneys and paralegals, and that has dwindled over time, again, because of limitations on funding. But our poverty law project exists to combat the injustices of poverty and address it at the root. And we represented low-income Vermonters in areas from housing, public benefits expungement, debilitating tax and debt disputes. And we advocate on behalf of low-income people to address the systemic and institutional causes of poverty.
So before you go on, and I don't want you to back up, but just for folks, it's 13 VSA section 4820, where the obligation to provide that people are entitled to have counsel appointed from Vermont Legal Aid to represent them in the hearings. So just so folks know where that is at.
So this particular project here, the poverty law project, I believe we're at approximately 8.2 FTEs. And I think when I came last year, I was already talking about the decrease over the years and the amount of staff that we've had, but we're at 8.2 now. In 2018, that project was around like 14.3.
And when I started, I started as an attorney in the disability law project at Vermont Legal Aid, at least 20 people in that project. It's been level funded for so long, it's just eroding to
Right.
less than half of what it used to be.
So we're turning into a skeleton crew in some of our very poor areas of service. We also have our tenant representation pilot, which assists with representation when it comes to evictions, but it's limited to 2 counties and it's a pilot. It's Lamoille and Windsor. And then we have our Victims' Rights Project, another skeleton crew, which is unfortunate, but we help survivors of crime with protective orders, family law advice, and protecting their rights in criminal cases, and a range of services from legal advice and information to full representation in civil and criminal courts. I know that they've been trying to push for a number of laws also on behalf of survivors of crime in order to protect their rights. Vermont doesn't have a Victims' Bill of Rights, which was strange to me, because I come from New York and we have a Victims' Bill of Rights there. But the project does incredible vital work. And again, it's one of those projects that has a skeleton crew. So like, let me just pull up the number of folks, and I have it at 2.5 FTE. And I was just told yesterday by Andrea's supervisor, I mean, we're really invested in informing the State House about the urgent need for increased funding, and we've stolen Andrea for that purpose. And so it's even more of a skeleton crew. But I think that's another project where we really need some funding support to be able to add some attorneys. So this is a chart that I believe Andrea shared with the committee via email, but this represents the work that we've been doing throughout Vermont State. So it covers some of the cases, which you'll find in the rectangles. And then we briefly talked about clinics and our efforts to provide clinics, particularly in places where we feel like there are legal deserts, and that's represented by circles. So you'll see the last time we spoke about wanting to increase clinics in Brattleboro. So there's a small number there. There's Bennington, need to bring clinics there, and we're trying to work on that. But again, limitations on resources. And then I already talked about some of the other underserved areas in terms of cases generally, but then also clinics like the Northeast Kingdom, Essex County. But this is in essence an illustration of the impact of our work, and we've served over 15,000 Vermonters in 2024 alone. So the federal funding, I printed out all of the, we've been running through our numbers constantly trying to figure out scenarios of what's going to happen with our funding streams. So a third of our funding is from federal sources. So it's looking like it's actually over a third. Yeah, over a third of our funding sources are federal, whether they're direct or pass-throughs. And all of this funding is vulnerable. One of the examples that I provided was our housing discrimination law project, which we anticipate is either going to be extremely delayed in funding and or the funding will be terminated. And we're trying to figure out whether or not we can absorb some folks into other projects. As I said before, our homeowner legal assistance program and the funding ended in December 2024. We're trying to stretch funding from anywhere to try to sustain housing homeowner rights work. But again, that funding is limited. And then our tenant, our health project funding is ending in July of 2025. And we've had a hiring freeze just to be able to sustain our staff and try to move them around where possible. But the reality is that we're short-staffed, and it's gotten to the point where we're trying to stretch each position, sometimes even into, I don't know, decimal points that don't make sense, like half here and half there. But like having to stretch them to like 0.2 here, 0.3 here. And as you can imagine, that can be a challenge to split people between so many projects, but we're trying to spread the funding as much as possible to cover both. We don't want to end up in layoff land, but depending on how things go with federal funding, I mean, if we actually lost the 1/3 funding, for us, it would be catastrophic. I think the math would be approximately 20 FTEs. And we did multiple scenarios. Right now, we're focused on the scenario of potentially losing our housing discrimination law project. And if we lost that project, that would be around, I think it's 2.3. Sorry, 2.5 FTEs. And that's, you know, just hoping that it's limited to just this project. But if we were to think of other scenarios, see, if we were to lose some funding from our disability law project, our taxpayer clinic project, and our HDLP, at minimum, that would impact 3.7 FTEs. And then if we lost the complete 1/3, it would be around 20 FTEs. Presently, we have approximately, I think it was like 87 staff, some of whom are part-time. But presently, Vermont Legal Aid has about 87 staff.
And how much is the 1/3? What's the dollar figure on the 1/3?
So the 1/3, they've been running numbers multiple times, so please don't quote me. I'll try to come back with an exact number. We know it's over
So
a third,
approximately.
and I'm thinking it's around like 4 million.
Just the approximate. Angela.
I was just gonna ask, the 80, you said 87 and 87 FTE or
Oh, sorry. 87 staff
87
members,
staff.
some of them are part-time.
okay, and it sounds like that's a lower number than, that number's been trending down over the years, or?
I mean, we've been able to, over the last couple of years, I mean, we've been kind of running a dance where we haven't had to
Okay,
lay off anybody yet. And so, and they're at 87, I'm at 18 in my shop, so it's not an additional on top of those folks. But both of us at the beginning of this year for 25 started by a projected deficit budget. And we've been scrambling to kind of fill in those holes, but it's very tenuous.
It's been back-to-back deficit budgets 2 years in a row. And what we've been doing thus far is if people happen to leave, which not many people do, we sometimes just don't fill those roles. And or if they get promoted, we just don't fill those roles.
Yeah.
But we want to be able to compensate these teams so that they can have capacity to address the needs of the community. But that's been a challenge because you can only stretch attorneys and or staff so far between projects.
and do you have, I mean, this may be impossible to answer, but are there current executive orders or other federal action that are particularly concerning? Meaning, you mentioned the housing discrimination work. Is there anything that's already been issued that has you worried that you might lose some part of your federal funding?
I mean, there have been some executive orders, I think in connection with, well, definitely there's the Department of Education, so there's probably some concern, there is concern around like special education, and the needs of students with, disabilities. And it's not just the funding piece, like we know that, there is, an objection to anything touching diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so obviously that would impact our housing discrimination project, but it's not just the financial piece. The executive orders may extend to limiting who we can help. So let's say specific categories of folks are listed as folks who cannot receive services due to, some of the funding coming from the feds. It's not just the complication of the financial portion, which is a huge part of it, but then the other complication, what we're talking about is we're trying to also plan for what do we do if we're told you cannot help particular populations. So that's an
Meaning if you're told you cannot help particular populations and your funding is dependent on you not helping those particular populations.
And we're trying to take things day by day because we don't know how things are going to go. What we're suspecting right now is the housing discrimination law project, just the termination of staffing alone, like at minimum is going to result in a massive delay. They're already delayed before those positions were cut. So, but we anticipate likely termination. And then the rest we're taking day by day and building out scenarios because we have to plan into fiscal year 2026. And our hope is that we don't have to lay people off because this is a really challenging time for folks. And I think it would be devastating because there's already a ripple effect from terminations on the federal level. So we're trying to retain staff as much as we can, but as you know, even level funding sets us back each year. Andrea, I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. Okay, it wasn't working before. All right, so just so you can understand Vermont legal aid sources of revenue, we talked a little bit about how a third of the budget comes from the federal government. For AHS, we're still trying to get some clarification about where in the governor's budget, various portions of our budget is located because it's split in multiple areas, and we tried to consult with multiple people about where those things live so we can find out the exact number. But I think our guesstimate was approximately 2.9 million from what we can gather. And our assumption was that we were level funded. And so I know you asked the question about Vermont Bar Foundation funding, so that accounts for approximately 7% of our budget. Trying to find I wanted to try to tell you a dollar amount, but it's approximately 7% of our budget. And then other nonprofit funding that comes from things like maybe rent. So for instance, Legal Services Vermont pays some rent, some funding from smaller nonprofits. But those are essentially our funding streams. Did folks have questions about that? So just to give you the number for the Vermont Bar Foundation, the approximate 7% is around like $750,000. All right, so LSVs.
Right, I can speak also briefly to where we're getting our funding. We actually rely very heavily on federal funds through the Legal Services Corporation, and that's a little under half of our budget altogether. At the moment, luckily, LSC is one of these kind of quasi-federal agencies. It's separately incorporated. So it's not directly under the executive branch. So for the moment, that funding's been intact. That's a combination of our general funding that gets divided proportionally among all the LSC agencies in the country, and some specialty grants that we do to promote pro bono work, and some technology to support self-help things like features on our website and other ways that we use technology to leverage some assistance for folks. So that's a little under half our budget. The other, again, just slightly under half, is that money that channels through Vermont Legal Aid. So it's a range of different ways that works, but a lot of it is contract work. So again, we're providing that helpline service, and legal aid benefits from that. So we have a significant amount of funding that comes in through all of those pieces. And so all of the general funding that then comes in through the state and the federal grants to legal aid filters down to us that way. So it is a kind of symbiotic relationship. And then a few other small foundation grants, so a little bit of donations, but that's primarily how that operates. And we're 18 people. We're running about a $2.5 million budget.
And I think Sam talked to us a little bit about the increase in legal needs based on the legal needs assessment. Do you think you can walk on?
Yes, I mean, this is just, it's one particular graphic. One of the things that we used to measure was just how much time it took literally to answer the phone. How much staff time, and back, in the early days of the helpline, we started it about, a little before that, but it was generally, a couple of, it didn't take a huge amount of staff to do all that. And right now, it just, again, it shot up during the pandemic, and it's just been, those hours have just been creeping up steadily. And every year, I just have to put more and more staff time just so that we can be responsive. And we have been in situations where, if I have somebody out sick, we can, for non-emergency calls, it can be, we've gotten as bad as 3 weeks behind in even being able to return people's calls, let alone anything else. And that's just not feasible for these people with real legal needs. We've got that down to about a week now for non-emergency cases. And again, as I think I mentioned last time, I have one FTE's worth of staff just to read those incoming messages so we can pick out the calls that we need to answer right now. And then I have one or two attorneys who are on call every day to answer those calls as they come in. And it takes all of that time just to respond to those immediate needs. And again, I'm doing this with a staff of 18. So it's a lot.
So I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but our poverty law project used to be really robust, and it's just unfortunate now with the poverty rate at nearly 10% that we have such a reduction in our poverty law staff. In addition, in terms of family law assistance, the needs also soaring. So in 2018, 48% of individual rights cases involved crime victims, but by 2023, that jumped to 67%. And like I said before, Skeleton Crew and our Victims' Rights Project, we're trying to be able to add an attorney so that they can have the capacity to address this growing need. And then the same prices we talked about before, there's been a 45% increase in requests for legal assistance when it comes to evictions. And again, housing prices year after year is getting worse and worse. And so we're really hoping that we can have enough funding to sustain our work, helping folks with housing issues.
Just a question, going back up, what kind of, so it says the family law assistance, what kind of assistance?
I think those are almost all going to be domestic violence cases. So I think, as I said last time, anything that doesn't involve domestic violence, we're really just sending those folks to the private bar in the hope that somebody will pick it up. All of the family cases that are actual direct delivery of service are ones where somebody is there's some kind of violence or threats of violence.
And are those cases sometimes then referred to the network? I know has.
Yeah, again, this is another one of these areas where we kind of divide up the state geographically.
Okay.
But again, it's not at all uncommon because again, my staff person is the one who has to make that distribution to all of those people, and at least every single agency at some point in the last year said, we just can't take any more cases right now. They've all been maxed out, as have the folks at legal. So sometimes we're really just left with, a phone call of advice and try to do what we can, but it's the kind of direct assistance is marginal.
Okay. Thanks.
And Andrea is an amazing member of our Victims' Rights team. Do you have anything to add about her?
Yeah, I mean, who would agree about it? So if that gives you any idea of how much work they do.
Karen.
Sorry, I just went back, because I missed looking at the map, looking at that and just seeing how there's some real differences across counties. Is that because this piece you're saying that there's other resources and supports in different counties, or is it need? Is it?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, are you looking at the case numbers or the clicks?
Maybe both. Anything you want to share?
Case numbers, I think generally, at least the last time, I did a full demographic study, mostly that does go pretty evenly by population. And we're, people are calling us from everywhere. We definitely get calls from Essex County. We get calls from Grand Isle. So the cases themselves, I think generally are relatively proportional to the population. The clinics where we're going in person are really, that's a resource issue. Who can we send to what area? What kinds of programs might we have set up already with, with a local provider? We have, my group does some in-court eviction clinics. And so you'll see a pretty high number in Rutland because we're there, but we're not in Bennington. or in Brattleboro. So, there's a much larger number involved.
Because would you say the clinics are, and so definitely, I'm not trying to separate the two, like increased funding, but also trying to look at, if increased funding isn't a possibility, are there other things that we can be looking at? Do you see clinics as a tool that reach more people, are more effective, and some counties aren't able to do them, some are?
Yeah, I mean, so again, we do these things in courts, and we've absolutely been asked by clerks in other courts and by judges in other courts, can you bring this to us? But we don't have the staff to do it. So yes.
And I think it's helpful, but ultimately representation. I mean, there's quick advice, but in a lot of legal issues, folks really need representation. And I think that's the challenge. And from my understanding, it's just really difficult to recruit in the South. And I've talked to community members about that. There just aren't enough attorneys in the South. And it's one of the things we've been talking about outside of, BLA, about what we can do about, because, Vermont has law office sitting and things like that. Like, how can we utilize things like that to bring legal talent to these underserved areas? But that's a part of the issue.
Right, and again, with a number of these clinics, we do rely on volunteer attorneys. So we're in Chittenden County, if we're here in Montpelier, there are lawyers who will come into court and come in for a couple of hours and do that work. Brattleboro and Bennington, that's not happening.
I guess that would be part of my question. With increased funding, would you feel like you could get more geographical representation, or would it just be creating more capacity at the places that already exist?
I think absolutely we could, because Vermont Legal Aid has not been able to replicate that in-court clinic model, even though, for example, they've got an office in Springfield. They could get to the South area, but you have to have the staff there to run it.
And it's an interest and a priority of ours to serve underserved area. And I've made it my mission for this year. I was just like, people need to stop talking about, let's go do work, but it doesn't happen. No, we're going to go to the South and we're going to do things at minimum, bring clinics. But again, clinics cost money and require resources. But we're working on that. Like, it's tragic that Bennington doesn't even have a circle. But we do want to serve these underserved areas and increase clinics there, but it's a capacity issue. And as you can imagine, with the anxieties and the increased request with legal assistance and uncertainty with what's happening these days, we're kind of pulled in directions, but we're still trying to be very organized about bringing services to these areas despite that. Like I said, our staff is extremely passionate about making a difference in Vermonters' lives, and they're stretching themselves as far as possible to accomplish that.
Yeah, that's a question.
Just very quickly, only because I am an attorney in Brattleboro. How are you reaching out? Like, it's like I've never been asked to volunteer. So, and I would be happy to. And so I'm just curious, are you guys like reaching out to the Windsor County Bar Association, the Windsor County Bar Association?
In order to do that, the way these clinics work is you have to have a staff person who's your point person on site
Yeah.
to make it happen.
Yeah.
So that's the barrier.
Oh.
Is that when we run a clinic in Rutland, one or two of my staff are driving down there and spending a day
Okay, so it's
to
not.
do that.
So it's not just the volunteer.
We don't, because we don't want to like kind of, I mean, because it's a fairly complicated area while we want on-site kind of expertise for the volunteers to be able to do it.
Yeah.
So there's a whole infrastructure that you need to build. We actually, to get the clinics that we have now in Chittenden, Rutland, Addison, Washington, and Franklin, I went through 2 rounds of 2-year each specialized grants from the Legal Services Corporation to build the framework to make those self-sustaining.
I see.
But we have not had further funding to expand that further.
Yeah.
And again, it takes our staff time to do the recruitment, to work with the courts, to schedule things. It's pretty labor intensive.
Okay.
So it is, you definitely need money to build that up to then put that infrastructure in place.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense, and I appreciate the clarification.
We also try to reach out to community partners. So like there's community partner in the group, which draws the Brattleboro community, and they've been great in kind of helping us understand community needs and how we should be responding, and they help us with some of the outreach work. But I do think, having the county bar associations, being connected with them could be helpful. And obviously, we love folks who want to volunteer, so I will take the business card. Like, we find an opportunity. But thank you for the question. So just generally speaking, our request, again, like I've said before, we make conservative requests because we could use a ton more than what we asked for, but we also know that the legislature is going through its own financial struggles, and that there are a number of organizations doing good work that are requesting money. We're asking for 1.6 million for base funding. As you can imagine, costs have increased with time, but also a number of our projects their funding has terminated. So for instance, our housing work, like I said before, our homeowner legal assistance project, the funding for that terminated in 2024. Our Housing for Everyone Law project, that funding is terminating in July 2025. Housing, HDLP, we believe is on the chopping block. So I don't think we're going to have funding that even carry us through 2025, level 2026 for that. So that's like 3 critical housing projects where the money is going to disappear in the housing crisis within Vermont. And so that's really troubling. And like we need to think about like the big picture. So when people don't have access to legal assistance, and we talk about it a lot, pro se is not good in court. It's burdensome to our courts. It's burdensome to both sides, whether there's representation or not, because it takes up time. And if someone's going up against someone who's pro se, that's costly, because there's likely going to be a lot of adjournments, a lot of extended litigation, just because there's someone who doesn't understand how to navigate the system. And so I just want to drive home the point, the importance of legal assistance and how investing in that is not just helping our community, it's helping the folks who are appearing before the court, it's helping the court itself. And so when we talk about that dollar being stretched to 11 and how we're trying to stretch it to like 20, we're thinking of like the grand scheme of things about how this is not just going to benefit the community, but it's also going to impact other areas like our courts and litigate folks that appear before the court. So housing, we're just really worried about the housing crisis. Like I said before, we're mandated by statute through our MHLP project, and there's been increased demands, not just for service, but there's increased emotional demands that come with the work. And I don't, quite frankly, from all the meetings that I've had, not enough staffing for it to be sustainable. Because the other thing is you want attorneys to be able to stay, and in this line of work, there's a heightened risk of challenges that come with the level of intensity of the work and then the gravity of the work.
So I'm curious to appreciate the clear ask. I feel like that's always nice to know exactly what we're going for. It's reminding me, because I remember when you came in last year to our committee, there was an ask, and I can't remember what happened to that though. Did any of that go through?
We believe we were level funded. Of course, I want to extend my gratitude because you always bring us in and listen to us. And I know you advocated for us to have increased funding, but we believe we were level funded last year.
Okay. I feel like that is an important thing to confirm. I am not exactly certain how we would be able to confirm that, because if it was an increase, I would be curious to know how that was spent or impacted, and kind of hear that to help inform this request as well.
That was my recollection.
I'm quite certain that our request was not great.
Okay.
Now, whether it was on the House or whether it went away in the Senate, I don't.
And my understanding is that we've had 2 consecutive years of deficits, and I think this year's deficit or 2025's deficit was higher than the last year, but I do not believe there was an increase. I believe it was level funding, which again, for us is a loss given the increase in cost.
And say on our end, the the federal funding that we get through the Services Corporation, we're dependent on Congress and we're on continuing resolutions. So at best, that's level funding. And again, level funding means that we're further behind just because of increased costs.
Thank you.
And just reiterating the need for building capacity for our Victims' Rights Project to be able to serve survivors of crime. Again, our poverty law project, I mean, we talked about how it's down from 10.8 to 8.2, but I think I gave you a little bit of a history about how robust the poverty law project was just a number of years back. And so the PLP needs to build capacity also to help address the issues of poverty, which again, increase in poverty in Vermont. And then we talked about the increased request for legal assistance when it comes to eviction and the need for legal assistance around that. And we just don't have the capacity. And then the housing funding streams, most of them are coming to an end.
A question with of those. So I know with the mental health legal project, there's an obligation in legislation. Is there an obligation with respect to those other parts of the ask? Doesn't make it any less important, but it.
I mean, most of it's really, it's discretionary. I mean, we don't have to represent everybody. We certainly turn many, many, many people away. I think that's the primary one. That's.
I think VOP,
VA, right.
the Vermont Ombudsman long-term care project, that one's also statutory. Mhm. Oh, sorry. So, I mean, I think we talked about this, but essentially without additional funding, with increases in costs, threats to federal funding. I mean, sometimes we rely on not hoping, but like that naturally, like maybe some people retire or maybe some folks move out of state, although we love all the people that work with us. Sometimes, that's a part of the calculation, but ultimately without increased funding and with the way things are going with federal funding, I would imagine further reduction in staff. We're trying really hard. It's like, we call it musical chairs, playing musical chairs all the time, figuring out how we can divide people across multiple different projects, even though that's complicated. But we're trying our best to retain staff, to reassure staff, and remind them how important their work is. But obviously, if there isn't enough funding, there's going to be a reduction in staff, reduction in service at a time where requests for service are at an all-time high. And then further exacerbation of the housing crisis and poverty in Vermont. That's not good. And then ultimately increased costs to the states. So like I said before, the burden on the courts, the burden on folks that appear before the courts. It's just there's a ripple effect there. That's not just that service is cut off. There's an impact that goes beyond that. These are some challenging times, and I think, we hope that you would support a request for increased funding. I hope we've made clear the amount of legal assistance that's needed out there, the amount of people that we have to turn away, the termination of projects that's upcoming, one that's potentially on the chopping block, more that may potentially follow. And so I think a lot of organizations that are doing public interest, social justice work, I think are very anxious in this moment because they care about the work and they want to do the work. But ultimately, we have to take things day by day and react accordingly. But like I said, we have committed staff and we're trying our best to meet the needs with what capacity we do have. I think it's helpful sometimes to hear what clients have to say. We do give surveys to some of the folks that interact with us and or receive legal services from us, and I wish I had more. I can get more if you would like, but I can just imagine these folks and, folks who have received services from Vermont Legal Aid or Legal Services Vermont to have an idea of what your rights are, what your options are, and to, at minimum, be directed makes a world of a difference. And if further support and capacity can be built, you know, for the representation and litigation piece, then people are supported even further when they're going through hardships. And it feels like someone has saved your life. Like, let's say you're a survivor of a crime and someone helps you get a protective order. That is saving your life. You know, you're about to be on the streets with like 4 of your kids. Someone helps you with your eviction case. That's saving an entire family. I think our attorneys do incredible work, and like I said, try to stretch every dollar that you all give us. And I think we're really grateful to all of them for their work, but also grateful to all of you, because between last year, and I would imagine this year, you've been a very supportive committee when it comes to our asks, and I think it's because you recognize the importance of the work. You gave us an entire hour, which we're grateful for, and we took up.
I appreciate it. It's been very helpful to dig deep into it. So last question, because we're gonna.
Well, I've, maybe this has been asked, but it feels, what is in the governor's recommended budget level funding?
Pretty sure it was level.
You mean for what?
For this
So-
year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was my understanding is. that-
So is it, did you get the 3% increase?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Is the reason why we're not able to tell is because you were explaining it's broken up into.
Yeah.
Consulted with a number of people to try to locate all of them and add them up, but we don't think that there was an increase.
Okay,
It's based on our budgets.
right, and do you have an opportunity similar to this, but maybe not an hour, do you, like, do you go to someone in EHS and say, and make your case, the way that you have
I
done
mean,
here?
we build relationships and we let them know, we try to have at least a meeting where we express it. I know when I first started with Vermont Legal Aid, that's one of the first things I did, and then I think they had a new person just joined their team, so I introduced myself, and we will generally send out a letter and or have a meeting and express our needs, but, you know, there's always a limitation to funding and an acknowledgement that there are a number of organizations that are in a similar position that need funding, and we've talked about exploring ways that, you know, we can work with each other and or support each other, but my understanding is that when it comes to the funding piece, there are limitations on that. But we make the ask. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for coming in.
I'll send you, I know we have a fabulous team. Everyone got together really quickly. We wanted to get you the information that you were looking for. And if you have other questions or would like additional information, I think, did I put it on here? There we go. So if you would like to get in touch with our legislative specialist, you can send any questions or requests to her, and she's pretty responsive, so she'll get it to you. And happy to come in anytime that you think our testimony would be beneficial.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. So folks, do people need a 3-minute break to stretch?
Yes.
Or get coffee? So we'll just go off live and we'll be 3 minutes, which means